May 4th, 1942, Corregidor Island, Philippines. Pre-dawn darkness blankets the concrete fortress as explosions light the sky in stuttering flashes of orange and white. First Lieutenant Eunice Young stands on the parade ground with 76 other American military nurses, watching the eastern horizon ignite. The island trembles beneath their feet. Around them, soldiers are destroying classified documents, burning files, dismantling radio equipment. The sound of artillery fire reverberates through the tunnels that honeycomb the rocky outcropping. This is not the first time these women have heard the Japanese guns. It is simply the last time they will hear them on free soil. Eunice is 31 years old. She has been a nurse for more than a decade, and for the last 5 months she has served as chief nurse at Corregidor General Hospital, a sprawling underground facility carved into Malinta Tunnel. She has held the hands of dying men. She has amputated limbs by candlelight when the generators failed. She has rationed plasma and blood because there was never enough. And now, as the Japanese artillery pounds the island with the relentless rhythm of a death knell, she knows that the end has come. The nurses had arrived in the Philippines as part of the Army Nurse Corps contingent just 18 months earlier. They came from hospitals in San Francisco and Manila, from military installations across the Pacific, and from stateside bases where they volunteered for overseas service. They came believing they were part of an invincible force, part of an American military machine that had never lost a war on its own soil. They came believing they would care for American soldiers in triumph. Instead, they found themselves watching an empire collapse in real time. The Japanese invasion had begun on December 8, 1941. Less than 24 hours after Pearl Harbor. The attack came suddenly, overwhelming, and with a precision that shattered American confidence. The nurses witnessed the first weeks of combat from their posts in Manila, watching the city absorb aerial bombardment, watching Filipino civilians stream into the streets in panic, watching American confidence transform into something else entirely. By late December, the decision came down from headquarters. The nurses would be evacuated to Corregidor, along with critical medical personnel. Corregidor itself was a vision from another war. The island fortress had been built 2 decades earlier, designed as an impregnable citadel in Manila Bay. It bristled with anti-aircraft batteries and coastal defense guns. Its tunnels ran for miles underground, lined with hospital beds, ammunition stores, and command centers. It was supposed to be the last redoubt, the place where American forces would hold out until reinforcements arrived from the mainland. But reinforcements never came. General Douglas MacArthur had left the Philippines on March 11, promising to return but leaving behind thousands of soldiers and nurses to face an enemy that grew stronger with every passing day. By early May, the fortress was dying. The Japanese had conquered the Philippines and now focused their full attention on Corregidor. The water was rationed. The food was nearly gone. The ammunition was low. The wounded piled up in the underground hospital faster than the nurses could care for them. Young and her nurses worked 18-hour shifts, then 20-hour shifts. Then they simply stopped counting. They moved from patient to patient in a daze of exhaustion, carrying bedpans, changing bandages, comforting men who knew they would not survive to see home again. On May 4th, just before dawn, the order came down through the ranks. The fortress would be surrendered. General Jonathan Maeda, the commanding officer of Corregidor, had authorized the white flag. Within hours, it would be raised above the island. Within hours, the American garrison would lay down their weapons. And within hours, 77 American military nurses would cease to exist as free women. The nurses gathered their meager possessions. Some carried photographs of families they might never see again. Some carried letters they had written but never mailed, messages to mothers and husbands and children, documentation of their final hours of freedom. Eunice Young stood among them, looking out at the bay, watching the Japanese fleet appear on the horizon like a gathering of steel predators. She had no idea what would happen next. None of them did. What awaited them in captivity would defy history, defy statistics, and defy every grim prediction about what the Japanese army did to prisoners of war. May 5, 1942. Manila Harbor, Philippines. The nurses stand on the deck of a military transport ship, watching Corregidor fade into the distance behind them. The island that had been their home, their workplace, their fortress against the tide of Japanese conquest, now appears small and vulnerable against the vastness of the sea. Many of the women will never see it again. The journey from Corregidor had been chaotic and terrifying. After the surrender was formalized, Japanese soldiers had moved through the underground tunnels with rifles and bayonets fixed, herding American personnel into groups. The nurses were separated from the men and moved at gunpoint toward the dock. Some had expected immediate violence. Some had heard the rumors that had circulated through the underground hospital in those final days. Stories whispered between shifts about what Japanese soldiers did to female prisoners. But the violence did not come. The soldiers were businesslike, efficient, and apart from the occasional shove or barked command, they left the women largely untouched. Now, packed onto a transport ship with hundreds of other American prisoners, the nurses tried to make sense of what was happening. The ship carried officers, enlisted men, and civilians along with the nursing contingent. The conditions were abysmal. The ship was designed to carry cargo, not passengers, and certainly not prisoners. The holds were cramped, poorly ventilated, and fetid with the smell of too many bodies in too small a space. Men were sick from dysentery. Some were wounded and infected. The nurses, even in their captive state, attempted to care for the sick where they could, offering water when there was water, offering comfort when comfort was all they had to give. Among the nurses was Second Lieutenant Hattie Brantley, a tall woman from North Carolina with dark hair and dark eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. She had been working as a surgical nurse at Corregidor, assisting in operations where the surgeons performed miracles with inadequate equipment and depleted supplies. She had seen things in those tunnels that would stay with her for the rest of her life. Now, watching the other prisoners suffer in the fetid hold of the transport ship, she made a decision that would define her time in captivity. She would document what happened. She would remember names. She would bear witness. If she survived, she would tell the story. If she did not survive, perhaps someone else would find her notes. The ship sailed for 3 days. When it finally reached Manila, the prisoners were herded onto the dock and marched through the streets under guard. Filipinos watched from the sides of the roads, their faces showing a mixture of pity and fear. The American prisoners were no longer conquerors. They were defeated men and women, marching in chains through a city that had once been an American colonial possession. The march led inland from the harbor, toward the Universidad de Santo Tomas campus on the edge of Manila. Santo Tomas had been a private Catholic university before the war, a beautiful compound with open quadrangles, dormitory buildings, and administrative structures. The Japanese had selected it as an internment camp for American civilians and military personnel. It would become the home of the 77 American military nurses for the next 3 years. As the nurses passed through the gates, they saw what awaited them. The campus had been transformed into a prison. Barbed wire ringed the perimeter. Guard towers stood at intervals. Japanese sentries watched from elevated platforms with rifles and machine guns. The beautiful campus, with its Spanish colonial architecture and tree-lined plazas, had become a cage. Inside that cage were already thousands of prisoners. American businessmen, diplomats, missionaries, teachers, engineers, and families who had been living in the Philippines when the war began. The nurses would join them in this captive community. They were assigned to a dormitory building that had once housed university students. The building was crowded, with far more people than it was designed to hold. Beds were crammed into every available space. Privacy was non-existent. The women would sleep in shifts, rotating through the limited bedding available. Water for washing was strictly rationed. Sanitation was primitive. Disease was inevitable. But as the nurses began to understand the structure of the camp, they realized something that initially seemed impossible. The Japanese were not executing them. They were not torturing them. They were not subjecting them to the kind of systematic abuse that was being documented in other Japanese prisoner of war camps across the Pacific. The Japanese commandant of Santo Tomas was Tomosu Tsuruta, a man in his 50s who seemed to operate according to a different set of rules than many other Japanese officers. He allowed the prisoners to organize themselves, to establish committees, to manage the internal affairs of the camp. He permitted American doctors and nurses to continue practicing medicine. He allowed the nurses to maintain a small infirmary and to continue caring for the sick. This did not mean the camp was comfortable. It meant only that it was not deliberately designed for extermination. Eunice Young and the other nurses quickly established a routine. They would work in the camp infirmary, treating the sick and injured among the prisoner population. They would assist in the makeshift hospital that had been established in one of the campus buildings. They would share their medical knowledge with the Filipino nurses and orderlies who worked alongside them. They would become the caretakers of a captive community that depended on them for survival. But there was one problem that would define their time in captivity more than any other factor. There was not enough food. June 1942. Santo Tomas Internment Camp, Manila. The sun rises over the campus and burns through the tropical heat of the Philippines. In the dormitory where the American military nurses sleep, women wake to the sound of the wake-up bell, a harsh, metallic clanging that echoes across the compound. 77 women rise from their beds and prepare for another day that is fundamentally the same as the day before and will be fundamentally the same as the day after. First Lieutenant Eunice Young steps outside into the already oppressive heat and joins the line forming for the morning meal. The kitchen is located in a separate building, and the food is distributed once per day at noon and once in the evening at 5 o'clock. Breakfast is a thin rice gruel, barely warm, flavored with whatever vegetables might be available. This morning it is boiled water with rice and a few strands of green vegetable matter that might have once been a leafy plant. The portion fits in a small bowl, perhaps 2 cups of liquid if it can be called that. Eunice consumes the gruel in a few minutes. Her stomach immediately demands more. The hunger begins as soon as the meal ends, a hollow ache that will persist for the next 23 hours until the noon meal arrives. The Japanese have allocated to each prisoner in Santo Tomas a daily ration of 700 calories. To understand what this number means, one must understand what the human body requires. An average adult at rest requires approximately 1,500 to 2,000 calories per day, simply to maintain basic bodily functions. A woman performing physical labor, caring for patients, walking the grounds of the camp, burning energy through the act of living, requires even more. 700 calories is starvation rations. It is not life. It is merely a postponement of death. But the prisoners do not know the exact calorie count initially. What they know is hunger. What they know is that their clothes begin to hang loose within weeks. What they know is that their bodies begin to consume themselves, converting muscle and fat into energy, trying to sustain life on inadequate fuel. The nurses, accustomed to understanding nutrition and physiology, quickly recognize what is happening. They are being slowly starved. The rations consist primarily of rice. Rice is cheap and filling in small quantities. It provides carbohydrates and some calories, but little nutritional value beyond that. The Japanese acquire the rice through requisitions from the local Filipino population, who are themselves struggling with food shortages under the occupation. Along with the rice comes whatever vegetables can be obtained. Sometimes there are sweet potatoes or squash or beans. Sometimes there is very little beyond the rice itself. Meat is almost non-existent. Dairy products do not exist. Fruits are rare. The diet is monotonous, inadequate, and designed to keep the prisoners alive, but not healthy. The nurses begin to organize themselves to address the crisis. They establish a detailed record of what each person consumes. They monitor weight loss. They watch for signs of disease and malnutrition. They see the early symptoms of beriberi, a disease caused by thiamine deficiency, beginning to appear in the camp population. They see scurvy beginning to develop, signs of vitamin C deficiency showing up in the form of bleeding gums and skin lesions. They see people becoming listless and weak, their bodies shutting down non-essential functions in an attempt to preserve energy for survival. Second Lieutenant Hattie Brantley, the nurse who had made a decision to document everything, begins writing in a small notebook she has managed to conceal. She writes about the food situation. She writes about the prisoners she sees developing disease. She writes about the politics of the camp, the tensions between the American civilians and military personnel, the leadership structures that have emerged. She writes as a witness, creating a record that she hopes will survive. The nurses themselves begin to show signs of malnutrition. Their faces become gaunt. Their collarbones become pronounced. Their hair begins to thin, but they continue their work. They continue to tend to patients in the infirmary. They continue to help maintain the sanitation of the camp. They continue to live because they have no choice but to live, and because the act of caring for others gives meaning to their captivity. The camp has been organized by Commandant Suruta into different sections based on nationality and status. The American military nurses are housed together, which allows them to maintain their unit cohesion and to support one another. This is significant. The bonds between these women, forged in the underground tunnels of Corregidor where they work together under fire, remain strong. They share what little food they have. They help one another through illness. They encourage one another when despair threatens to overwhelm them. There is an internal economy that develops within the camp. Some prisoners have resources. Some have hidden money or valuables before their capture. Some receive packages from outside the camp. Gifts from Filipinos, who still have sympathy for the Americans, or from Japanese sympathizers. These resources can sometimes be used to purchase additional food from the camp kitchen staff, or from Filipino workers who move in and out of the camp. The nurses, generally not wealthy and without hidden resources, participate minimally in this black market economy. They survive on their official rations and whatever they can obtain through their work. Months pass. The seasons change barely perceptibly in tropical Manila. The heat remains constant. The hunger remains constant. The prisoners develop routines that structure their days and give them purpose. Many undertake educational programs. Classes in language and literature and history are organized by the educated prisoners. Religious services are held. Theatrical performances are arranged using scrap materials and creative imagination. The prisoners are attempting to maintain their humanity, to preserve their minds and spirits, even as their bodies are consumed by inadequate nutrition. The nurses participate in these activities when they can, but their primary focus remains their work. They understand that they are privileged in a sense. They have a purpose. They have the knowledge and skills that allow them to contribute to the well-being of others. In a camp where many prisoners struggle with hopelessness and despair, the nurses have a reason to continue, a reason to endure. Their patients need them, but they also understand the danger. They have seen enough of human physiology to understand that the body can only consume itself for so long before vital organs begin to fail. They have watched men and women in other camps die of malnutrition and disease. They know that the statistics for prisoner of war survival in Japanese camps are grim. According to the reports that have filtered into the camp through occasional contact with the outside world, more than 1/3 of all prisoners of war held by the Japanese military do not survive captivity. Some estimates suggest the mortality rate is even higher. Yet as month follows month, and as the first year of captivity turns into the second year, the nurses begin to realize something remarkable. Nobody among their number has died. The nurses have survived where others have not. They have maintained their health relative to the general prison population. They have endured the starvation rations. They have resisted the diseases that have killed others. Nobody knows yet whether this survival will continue, whether it is a temporary reprieve or a sign that they might actually live through this war. But as the calendar turns from 1942 into 1943, something that seemed impossible at the moment of capture has become reality. The nurses are still alive. January 1943. Santo Tomas Internment Camp, Manila. The calendar on the wall of the infirmary marks another year of captivity. 8 months have passed since the fall of Corregidor. The nurses have been prisoners long enough that the shock of capture has faded. The reality of permanent captivity has set in. This is not a temporary situation. This is life now. The second year brings new challenges and new suffering. The general prison population has begun to show the accumulated effects of prolonged malnutrition. Prisoners who arrived in relatively good health have become skeletal. Men who had weighed 180 pounds now weigh 120. Women have lost so much weight that their bodies have begun to undergo disturbing changes. Menstrual cycles have stopped. Body fat has disappeared entirely. The skin hangs loose on the bones beneath. The prisoners have become ghosts of themselves, the living embodiment of slow starvation. Disease accompanies malnutrition like a shadow. Dysentery is endemic in the camp, spread through the inadequate sanitation facilities and the contaminated water supply. Tuberculosis begins to appear, spreading through the crowded dormitories. Malaria is present, transmitted by mosquitoes in the tropical environment. Infections that would be minor in a healthy body become serious in bodies depleted of nutrients and immune function. The infirmary is constantly full. The nurses work longer hours, treating more patients with fewer resources. Eunice Young has become the de facto chief medical officer of the camp. The American doctors work alongside her, but Young has emerged as the primary figure coordinating medical care. She has developed a system of prioritization, deciding which patients receive what limited medical resources. It is a terrible responsibility, a daily calculation of triage that amounts to deciding who will receive help and who will be allowed to deteriorate. She makes these decisions knowing that almost any medical intervention in a normal setting would be routine care, but in the camp, with no medicines beyond basic supplies, it amounts to decisions about survival. The nurses have discovered something crucial about their own survival. Their training as nurses means they understand nutrition and disease in ways that other prisoners do not. They understand the importance of consuming every calorie of their rations, no matter how inadequate. They understand the necessity of maintaining some level of physical activity to preserve muscle mass. They understand the psychological importance of structure and purpose. They have applied this knowledge to their own survival with the same rigor they apply to caring for their patients. But there is another factor that becomes increasingly apparent as the months pass. The nurses are being treated differently by the Japanese than other prisoners are. The camp commandant, Tomosu Tsuruta, has made a decision that will prove crucial to the nurses' survival. He has designated the nurses as essential medical personnel. This designation means that they receive slightly better rations than the general population. It means that they are given some priority in the distribution of whatever supplemental food becomes available. It means that they are not subjected to the same harsh labor assignments as other prisoners. Nobody is entirely certain why Tsuruta made this decision. Perhaps he recognized that healthy nurses would be more effective in preventing epidemic disease in the camp. Perhaps he possessed a sense of honor that extended to medical personnel, a code of conduct that saw nurses as different from soldiers. Perhaps he simply understood that the morale of the camp would be better if the American military nurses, who occupied a special place in the prisoners' minds, were visibly being treated with at least minimal respect. The reason matters less than the result. The slightly better rations and lighter labor assignments provide the margin between life and death for the nurses. Second Lieutenant Hattie Brantley continues her documentation. She has filled multiple notebooks with observations, names, dates, and details about camp life. She writes about which prisoners are showing signs of scurvy. She writes about the patients who have died in the infirmary. She writes about the smuggled food that occasionally arrives through sympathetic Filipino workers. She writes about the morale problems, the tensions that develop in a captive population where hope is in short supply. She hides her notebooks in different locations throughout the camp, terrified that if a Japanese officer discovers them, she will be punished severely. The documentation is her way of maintaining control, of imposing order on chaos, of insisting that this experience will be remembered and recorded. The nurses begin to develop a black market operation of their own. Though calling it such overstates its sophistication, they have discovered that some of the Japanese guards can be influenced with small gifts or through the intervention of sympathetic camp staff. Through careful negotiation and the expenditure of whatever resources they can gather, they manage to occasionally obtain supplemental food items. A Filipino worker might bring in a few papaya fruits, obtained at great risk to himself. A sympathetic Japanese guard might allow a small package to be delivered to the nurses' quarters. These items are modest in quantity but significant in nutritional value. A single piece of fruit can provide vitamin C that prevents scurvy. A small quantity of eggs can provide protein that helps maintain muscle mass. The nurses also begin to understand the social hierarchy of the camp. The American civilians, particularly the wealthy businessmen and diplomats, occupy a different status than the military personnel. The American officers have more resources and more connections than the enlisted men. The nurses occupy a unique position. They are military personnel but female. They are skilled professionals but captive. They are vital to camp health but powerless in the larger structures of the camp. This paradoxical position gives them a certain degree of social protection. Few prisoners would resent the nurses even when resentment of other privileged groups might be high. As the second year progresses, a terrible calculus becomes apparent. The prisoners are dying at a lower rate than might be expected given the conditions, but they are still dying. Every month brings news of another death in the camp. Usually it is someone who arrived already weakened, someone whose body could not adjust to the starvation rations. Sometimes it is someone who has lasted months but finally succumbs to accumulated deficiencies or disease. The camp commandant insists on recording these deaths, and a small cemetery has been established where the bodies are buried with simple markers bearing names and dates. But among the 77 American military nurses, death remains absent. Month after month passes. Prisoner after prisoner around them shows the symptoms of terminal decline, but the nurses endure. Their work continues. Their purpose remains clear. They are needed, and they live because they are needed. By the end of the second year of captivity, the nurses have made a quiet realization. They are going to survive this war. They do not know how long the war will last. They do not know what will happen before liberation comes, but they know, with a certainty born of experience and observation, that they have passed through the valley of death and emerged on the other side. They have beaten the statistics. They have defied the pattern. Around them, the war continues far away. American forces are advancing across the Pacific, island by island. The prisoners receive occasional news through rumor and through the Japanese announcements that Tsuruta allows to be posted. The war is not going well for Japan. The American military is returning, slowly but inevitably, and somewhere in the future, liberation awaits. February 1944. Santo Tomas Internment Camp, Manila. The sound of distant aircraft engines becomes a familiar part of the camp's soundscape. The nurses, standing in the courtyard during a work break, look up at the sky and see formations of American bombers passing overhead, their silver bodies catching the tropical sunlight. The war, which had seemed so distant, so remote from the confines of the camp, is returning to the Philippines. The presence of American aircraft creates a peculiar emotional response among the prisoners. It is thrilling and terrifying simultaneously. The bombers represent hope for eventual liberation, a sign that American forces are advancing, that the tide of war has turned. But the bombers also represent immediate danger. Manila is a military target. The camp is located within the city. American bombs do not distinguish between soldiers and prisoners of war. As the raids increase in frequency and intensity, the prisoners face a grim possibility. They might be killed by their own country's military in the process of their liberation. The Japanese response to the American bombing campaign is to tighten security in the camp. Guards are increased. The prisoners are confined more strictly. The possibility of escape or rescue attempts is minimized through increased vigilance. The rations become even more meager as Japanese supply lines are disrupted by the bombing and by the American military advance across the Pacific. Food becomes so scarce that prisoners begin to consume things they would never have considered edible under normal circumstances. Grass is boiled and eaten. Tree bark is processed into something resembling food. Every calorie that can be extracted from any source is extracted. Eunice Young and the other nurses continue their work even as the situation deteriorates. The infirmary overflows with patients suffering from malnutrition, disease, and now, increasingly, injuries from bombing raids. There have been several close calls. Bombs have fallen near the camp. Buildings on the perimeter of the campus have been damaged. The nurses treat the wounded, tend to the traumatized, and try to maintain some semblance of order in a situation that is becoming increasingly chaotic. Second Lieutenant Hattie Brantley's notebooks have grown to several volumes now. She has documented everything. She has written names and dates and medical conditions. She has recorded the deaths she has witnessed. She has written descriptions of the camp, the food situation, the treatment of prisoners. She has become obsessed with the idea that this record must survive, that it must be preserved so that after the war, people will know what happened here. She has hidden the notebooks in different locations, divided them so that if one cache is discovered, not everything will be lost. She carries the knowledge of where they are hidden like a sacred trust. The third year of captivity brings a strange acceleration of events. By early 1945, American forces have island-hopped across the Pacific and are now approaching the Philippines themselves. The prisoners in Santo Tomas begin to receive news, sometimes confirmed by official Japanese announcements, sometimes by rumor that filters through the camp. American forces have landed in Luzon. American forces are approaching Manila. The war, which has seemed eternal and unchanging, is reaching its climax. The Japanese commandant faces an increasingly impossible situation. He is supposed to maintain the camp and guard the prisoners, but the military situation is deteriorating rapidly. American forces control the skies and the seas. The Japanese army is being pushed back. The question that begins to circulate through the prisoner ranks is not whether liberation will come, but when. And the darker question is whether the Japanese will allow the prisoners to be liberated, or whether they will eliminate them to prevent them from falling into American hands. There are historical precedents for this fear. In other locations, as Japanese military positions became untenable, Japanese officers had ordered the execution of prisoners of war. The prisoners at Santo Tomas have heard these stories. The fear is real and justified. If Japanese forces decide that they cannot allow American prisoners to be captured alive by advancing American troops, the massacre would be swift and complete. But Commandant Tsuruta appears to have made another significant decision. Despite the pressure and despite the military situation, he does not order the execution of prisoners. Whether this decision stems from his sense of honor, his recognition that such an action would constitute a war crime, or simply his recognition that such an action is increasingly difficult to carry out as Japanese military discipline breaks down, the result is the same. The prisoners are not executed. They continue to live. In February 1945, the American military campaign reaches Manila. Fighting in the city is intense. The Japanese military, knowing that their defeat is imminent, fights with desperate ferocity. Manila becomes a battleground. Buildings are destroyed. The civilian population is caught in the crossfire. The prisoners at Santo Tomas find themselves in a war zone, caught between advancing American forces and desperate Japanese defenders. The nurses take shelter with the other prisoners. The sounds of combat fill the camp. Artillery shells land near the compound. Gunfire echoes through the streets. There is a period of terrifying uncertainty where nobody knows whether American forces will reach them in time, whether the Japanese will maintain control of the camp and its prisoners, whether they will survive this final chapter of captivity. On February 3, 1945, the moment comes. American soldiers appear at the gates of Santo Tomas Internment Camp. They are members of the 1st Cavalry Division, advancing through Manila in the final stages of the battle for the city. The prisoners, who have lived in captivity for nearly 3 years, see American uniforms for the first time since their capture. The sight provokes an almost hysterical response. People are crying, people are cheering, people are embracing one another. After nearly 1,090 days of captivity, liberation has arrived. The American soldiers are shocked by what they encounter. The prisoners are skeletal. Many can barely walk. The smell of malnutrition and disease hangs over the camp. The soldiers, who have fought their way across the Pacific and across the island of Luzon, are confronted with the reality of what prolonged captivity has done to their own countrymen. But as the American medical personnel begin to examine the prisoners and organize for evacuation and treatment, something becomes apparent. Among the 77 American military nurses, there are still 77 American military nurses. Nobody has died. In a camp where the mortality rate for prisoners of war under Japanese control had exceeded 35% in other locations, in a camp where thousands of prisoners suffered from advanced malnutrition and disease, the nurses have survived intact. The nurses themselves are ravaged by 3 years of inadequate nutrition. They are thin and weak. Many show signs of disease. Some will have permanent health effects from their captivity, but they are alive. All of them. Every single one. The incredible has become fact. The impossible has been achieved. Eunice Young, chief nurse, steps out of the camp with her unit intact for the first time in 3 years. She is no longer chief nurse of a captive community. She is now a survivor, a witness, a living testament to resilience under impossible circumstances. February 3rd, 1945 through 1946. Manila to San Francisco to hospitals across America. The nurses are evacuated from Santo Tomas under armed guard, moved through a city still convulsing with combat, transported to port facilities, where American medical personnel begin the process of treating acute malnutrition and disease. The journey from captivity to freedom is not instantaneous. It is a gradual transition, beginning with evacuation from the camp and continuing through months of hospitalization and recovery. The medical evaluation of the nurses reveals the cumulative effects of 3 years on inadequate rations. Many are suffering from avitaminosis, the general disease caused by prolonged vitamin deficiency. Some show signs of tuberculosis or other opportunistic infections. Some have permanent nerve damage from thiamine deficiency, damage that will cause chronic pain and dysfunction for the rest of their lives. Some have gynecological damage from the stress of prolonged malnutrition. The nurses have survived, but survival has come at a cost. They will carry the marks of their captivity in their bodies for decades, but they have also survived something else. They have survived intact as a unit. They have maintained their military organization and their bonds of sisterhood. They have emerged from captivity not as individuals but as a collective. This fact alone sets them apart from most other groups of prisoners who had been held by the Japanese during the war. Second Lieutenant Hattie Brantley emerges from the camp with her hidden notebooks. After liberation, as she recovers in the hospital, she retrieves her records and begins to organize them. She creates a comprehensive account of the nurses' time at Santo Tomas, documenting not just her own experience but the collective experience of all 77 women. She interviews other nurses. She records their stories. She creates what amounts to an informal oral history of the camp. Her work becomes one of the primary sources for understanding what happened to the nurses at Santo Tomas. The nurses are debriefed by military intelligence officers. They are questioned about conditions in the camp, about Japanese military personnel, about any information that might be valuable to the ongoing war effort against Japan. They are asked to provide testimony about their treatment, about any abuse they witnessed, about the conditions under which they were held. The debriefings are thorough and sometimes painful, as the nurses are forced to articulate experiences they have barely had time to process. What emerges from these debriefings and from the documentation compiled by Brantley and others is a historical record that defies expectations. The nurses were not abused in the way that many feared. They were not subjected to sexual violence or torture. They were not systematically mistreated by their Japanese captors. Instead, they were subjected to a different kind of cruelty, one more subtle and perhaps more insidious. They were starved. They were denied adequate medical care. They were confined. But they were not deliberately tortured or executed. Commandant Tsuruta had made decisions that allowed them to survive, whether from honor or pragmatism or some combination of both. The question of why the nurses survived becomes a subject of historical analysis and debate. The most obvious answer is practical and specific. The nurses received slightly better rations because they were designated as essential medical personnel. They performed work that was valuable to the camp administration. They had purpose and structure and meaning in their daily lives. They had the medical knowledge to understand their situation and to optimize their survival within the constraints they faced. They had each other and the bonds of military unit cohesion that kept morale from completely collapsing. But there is another factor that historians have identified, one that transcends the practical and enters into the realm of human dignity and respect. The Japanese military culture, despite its capacity for extraordinary brutality, also contained elements of the samurai code, the Bushido tradition that emphasized honor and respect for military personnel. The nurses, as military personnel, occupied a particular status in the Japanese understanding of warfare and captivity. They were not civilians to be discarded. They were not enlisted soldiers to be worked to death. They were officers in a medical capacity, professionals who merited a certain level of respect, despite being prisoners. This is not to suggest that the Japanese treatment of the nurses was merciful or ethical. 700 calories per day is starvation. 3 years in a prison camp while a war raged is torture regardless of whether it is deliberately intended. But it is to suggest that the Japanese response to the nurses' captivity, while brutal by any civilized standard, was less brutal than it might have been. Other prisoners of war held by the Japanese experienced death rates that exceeded 50%. The nurses experienced a death rate of 0%. This disparity, this miraculous exception to the pattern, requires explanation. After the war ends, the nurses are sent to various hospitals across the United States to complete their recovery. Some return to military service. Some leave the Army Nurse Corps and pursue civilian careers. Some struggle with what would later be understood as post-traumatic stress, though that term did not exist in 1945. Some never fully recover from the physical damage caused by 3 years of malnutrition. Some live long lives, marry, have families, and build careers. Some die relatively young, their bodies permanently compromised by their captivity. Eunice Young, chief nurse, spends months in hospital recovery before being discharged. She receives military commendations for her leadership during captivity. She is recognized as having maintained the morale and cohesion of her unit through impossible circumstances. She eventually returns to nursing and continues her career, but the experience marks her permanently. She becomes an advocate for prisoners of war. She works with military and government officials to ensure that the experience of the nurses is documented and remembered. She gives testimonies. She participates in war crimes, trials. She bears witness to history. Hattie Brantley's documentation becomes invaluable to historians and to military officials seeking to understand what happened at Santo Tomas. Her notebooks are preserved and eventually made available to researchers. Her work creates a detailed record of daily life in the camp, of the medical situation, of the human experience of prolonged captivity. She becomes recognized as a crucial source for understanding this particular chapter of World War II. The 77 nurses become known as the Angels of Santo Tomas, a title that reflects both their profession and their status as survivors of an ordeal that should have killed them. They are celebrated. They are honored. They are recognized as heroes, though many of them resist this characterization, insisting that they simply did their jobs and survived through luck and the support of their comrades and the decisions made by their Japanese captors that allowed them to live. The historical record of their survival becomes part of the larger narrative of World War II, part of the documentation of what Japanese prisoners of war camps were like, and how the experiences of prisoners varied significantly depending on location, commandant, and circumstances. The nurses at Santo Tomas become evidence that even within the brutality of Japanese military captivity, there were variations. There were decisions that could make the difference between survival and death. There were commandants like Tomosu Tsuruta who, for whatever reasons, allowed certain prisoners to live. In the decades after the war, as survivors of Japanese captivity share their stories and as historians conduct research, the story of the 77 nurses at Santo Tomas stands out as unique and remarkable. It is a story of survival against the statistics. It is a story of women who were subjected to starvation and disease and confinement, and who emerged not broken but intact, not defeated, but determined to bear witness to what they had endured. The nurses age. The war becomes history. The Cold War emerges and dominates international affairs. Decades pass. Some of the nurses pass away, taking their memories with them. Others live into old age, their experiences becoming part of their life story, the defining event that shaped everything that came after. But the historical record remains. The documentation compiled by Hattie Brantley and others survives. The testimonies given by the nurses in the years after liberation are preserved in archives. The story of what happened at Santo Tomas Internment Camp remains available to those who wish to understand it. And the fundamental fact remains unchanged. 77 American military nurses were captured in the Philippines in May 1942. They were imprisoned at Santo Tomas Internment Camp for 37 months. They were subjected to starvation rations of 700 calories per day. They were confined in inadequate facilities in a tropical disease environment. They were cut off from home, from freedom, from any certainty about their future, and every single one of them survived in a war that killed tens of millions, in a conflict that claimed the lives of vast numbers of prisoners of war, in a specific context where the Japanese treatment of captives was documented to result in death rates exceeding 35% for most groups. The 77 nurses of Santo Tomas beat the odds. They defied the statistics. They survived together, as a unit, as a family bound by shared experience and shared purpose. Their survival is not a miracle in the religious sense. It is a historical fact, explicable through the convergence of specific circumstances and decisions and human choices. But it is a remarkable fact, nonetheless. One that stands as testament to the resilience of the human body and spirit when subjected to extreme hardship. It is a story that deserves to be remembered, not as a tale of American triumph, but as a complex historical narrative of cruelty and survival, of captivity and liberation, of women who endured the unendurable and lived to tell the story. February 3rd, 1945. American soldiers liberated Santo Tomas Internment Camp and discovered that the 77 American military nurses who had been captured there 37 months earlier had all survived their ordeal. It is a story that Americans knew then and largely forgot. A story that became subsumed by the larger narratives of the Pacific War and American victory. But it is a story that deserves remembrance. A story of remarkable survival against impossible odds. A story of women whose names deserve to be remembered and whose experience deserves to be honored. The nurses themselves lived on. Some gave interviews. Some wrote memoirs. Some participated in reunion celebrations with their former comrades. And they carried with them always the knowledge that they had endured something that should have destroyed them. And they had come through it together, intact, alive, bearing witness to a chapter of World War II that history has largely forgotten but that they could never forget.